The day my mother's will was read felt less like a family gathering and more like a skirmish waged in whispers and sharpened glances. Oak paneling, polished wood, the faint smell of old paper, none of it softened the edge of my father's sneer or the practiced curl of my brother's smile. "You're just a waitress." "Shut up and sit down," my father said before the lawyer could clear her throat. I didn't argue. I didn't even blink. I gave Marion, my mother's attorney, a single deliberate nod and felt the room shift, like the moment before a storm finally cracks. I was 28 and still living in the Montana town where I was born. A small place cupped by plains that always seemed wider than whatever dreams tried to grow there. I worked double shifts at Rosie's Diner, poured coffee for truckers who made me laugh, and saved what I could in a jar that never looked as heavy as it felt. My father measured worth by titles and square footage. My brother Ryder measured it by glossy posts and leased interiors. They counted the world in trophies. I counted it in the names of regulars and the way my boss trusted me with the safe after closing. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And honesty has a way of staying when shinier things peel off in bad weather. My mother, Grace Miller, had hands that smelled faintly of lavender and a voice that could sand splinters from a hard day with only a sentence. "Paisley, you have more grit than both of them combined," she'd say, and she'd make me believe it for the length of a sunbeam across the kitchen floor. 2 years before the will reading, cancer arrived the way a slow storm approaches across the plains, inevitable, unrelenting, impossible to pretend away. We told ourselves she'd beat it. She wore that kind of quiet strength that fooled even doctors. But treatments ground down the sparkle in her eyes, and the calendar became a row of appointments I kept like a second job. I learned the exact time her tea should leave the stove to cool just right. I learned that silence can be a kind of medicine when pain makes words too expensive. My father visited with his watch always visible, thumbs tapping messages he pretended not to read. Ryder breezed in behind designer sunglasses and bouquets that looked like stage props. He loved a 14-minute visit and a filtered selfie captioned with a heart and something like "family first." The comments told him he was a good son. My mother and I didn't bother arguing with strangers. One night, when the curtain muted the afternoon sun and machines hummed like mechanical crickets, she asked me to close the blinds and sit closer. "There are things you don't know about your father and your brother," she whispered. I told her I knew enough too much, sometimes, but she shook her head. "They're counting the insurance money," she said, as if she were naming a weather pattern. Speaking of me like I'm a check waiting to clear. She held my wrist when my anger lunged for the door. "Not now," she said. "You'll have your moment." Then she reached into the bedside drawer and pressed a small black USB into my palm. "If they try to silence you, let this speak. I've made arrangements. Trust Marion when the time comes." I kept the drive in my purse and the promise in my ribs. When the second recurrence came, the doctor's language turned clinical and small, as if the right combination of syllables could make us forget what we already knew. 2 nights before she slipped into a coma, she said it again. "Don't fight him in the moment. Do what we planned." At dawn, she was gone, and the world rearranged itself around a silence I wasn't ready to learn. The week bled into flowers, casseroles, and people who said, "If you need anything," in voices that implied most things come with a receipt. Ryder texted, "See you at the reading?" My father avoided my eyes at the service, speaking to everyone else with the warmth of a man doing public relations for his soul. I ironed a plain black dress, tied my hair back, and placed the USB on the table in front of me that last night. I could have played it. I didn't. Some promises are built like bridges. You don't test them until you have to cross. On the afternoon of the reading, Green and Associates looked like a place built to make arguments behave. My father and Ryder sat together near the head of the table, King and Crown Prince rehearsing victory. Marian, all steady eyes and legal spine, folded her hands and waited for quiet to root. I took the chair opposite my father. He smirked, a man who already knew the ending. Marian began with dates and witnesses, the ceremonial drumroll of legality. My father's fingers drummed impatience. Ryder scrolled beneath the table, his smile half there, half checking whether the reflection in his phone approved. I'd like to say a few words, I said when the section for family statements arrived, my voice surprising me by not shaking. My father cut across it like a blade. No, you're not speaking here. Ryder added the shrug of a man allergic to discomfort. Don't make this weird. Paisley, we can be done in 10 minutes. I thought about emptying years of swallowed words into the room, lining them up like evidence. Then I remembered my mother's whisper, not now. I closed my mouth, slid my hand to my purse, and felt the edge of the USB like a small, loaded promise. Marian turned a page and spoke with the evenness of a woman who knows exactly where the floor will hold. Before we proceed to distribution, there is an addendum Mrs. Miller requested be heard in the presence of all beneficiaries. Ryder stopped scrolling. My father's hand stilled. I set the USB on the table and pushed it toward Marian. This is my mother's voice, I said. She wanted you both to hear it. The tiny speaker blinked awake, a soft click. Then the rustle of fabric. And at last, my mother's calm, deliberate tone, the one she used when truth needed to land without apology. This is Grace Miller. If you are hearing this, I am no longer here to say these words myself. Her voice filled the room the way light fills a dark corner, reaching places we had all convinced ourselves were safe from judgment. I have spent my life in this family, she said, loving 2 children and sharing a home with a man I once believed I knew. But in my final year, I learned hard truths about both my husband and my eldest son, Ryder. You spoke about me as if I were already gone. You spoke about insurance money, not with grief, but with anticipation. My father muttered something about context, but his grip on the armrest betrayed the crack in his armor. Ryder leaned forward, eyes narrowing, as if he could glare the recording into silence. Her words did not slow. Paisley has been my anchor. She was with me through every treatment, every sleepless night, every moment when I needed a hand to hold. She is the one I am most proud of. To my husband and to Ryder, you will receive nothing from my estate. This is not spite, but justice. You did not value me when I lived, and you will not profit from my death. The recording ended with her voice softening to something almost tender. Paisley, live your life free of their judgment. And if there is another life, I would still choose to be your mother. Silence weighed down the conference room. The tick of the wall clock seemed too loud. Marian removed the USB and set it gently on the table. My father's jaw worked, chewing on words he couldn't swallow. Ryder's leg bounced against the floor. Neither of them looked at me. Marian's voice was calm, her hands steady as she lifted the will. Now we will move to the reading of the Revised Testament. What followed was less like words and more like hammer blows. The house, valued at $420,000, transferred in full to me. Bank accounts totaling $212,000. Likewise, the beneficiary of the $1 million life insurance policy changed from my father to me. Every sentence was a nail in the coffin of their certainty. My father exploded first. "This is fraud." She was sick. She didn't know what she was signing. Paisley manipulated her. Ryder joined, pointing at me. "You were whispering in her ear every day, poisoning her against us." Marion shut the folder with a sound like a gavel. The will was witnessed, notarized, and is legally binding. If you wish to contest, it will be costly and very public. For a moment, my father's rage faltered at the mention of evidence. He shoved back his chair, muttering curses, his coat flapping like a flag of retreat. Ryder tried to bargain. "You can't just cut us out. We deserve something." I met his eyes. "Steady. You cut yourselves out when you treated her like a bank account instead of a person." The tension broke only when my Uncle Grant, who had been silent until then, spoke with the weight of someone who had watched long enough. "John, Ryder, you should be ashamed. Grace was my sister. I saw how Paisley cared for her when neither of you would lift a finger. This will is fair." My father snarled for him to stay out of it. Grant stood, unbending. "No, I won't. You've been selfish all your life. And Ryder, you've learned all the wrong lessons. Walk away quietly for once in your lives." They didn't. Ryder slammed the door behind him so hard the glass rattled. My father's curses echoed down the hall. When they were gone, the air felt lighter, though my chest was still tight. Marion pushed the folder toward me. "It's done. Everything is yours now. Grace wanted you to have the security she never did." I nodded, my throat thick. Uncle Grant put a hand on my shoulder. "You honored her today." I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, like a storm had passed and left me standing in a place that suddenly looked unfamiliar. Outside, relatives whispered in the hall, sympathy mixing with curiosity. "She left everything to Paisley," someone murmured. Another replied, "After what those two did, I don't blame her." I walked past without pausing. Their words couldn't stick to me anymore. In the parking lot, I saw my father and Ryder arguing near the SUV, arms slashing the air, faces tight with blame. They no longer looked like men united by blood, but like two losers scrapping over the pieces of a ruined game. Grant walked me to my car. "Want me to follow you home just in case?" I shook my head. They already lost the only fight that mattered. Still, I checked my mirrors all the way back. The house looked the same when I pulled into the driveway. The porch swing, the paint peeling near the gutter. But it was mine now. Not because of the deed, but because my mother wanted me here. I opened the door and smelled lavender, faint and familiar. I set my purse on the table, the USB beside it, and for the first time in years, I believed her words live free of their judgment. Weeks turned into months. The threats of lawsuits faded once Marion's letters made it clear there was no case to win. Ryder sent one last text, "Enjoy the house while it lasts," but silence was sharper than any reply. I painted the kitchen walls cream, the color my mother once said she wished for. I oiled the chains on the porch swing, framed the photo of us laughing in the diner. People at Rosie's asked if I would quit now that I had money. I didn't. The diner was my rhythm, my choice now. not a necessity chained to survival. The inheritance gave me freedom, not an escape from who I was. Sometimes, I sat at the table with the USB in my hand. I never played it again. I didn't need to. Her words were etched into me, as if they had been carved into bone. Uncle Grant visited often. We drank coffee on the porch, remembering her not in illness or anger, but in pie crusts, garden dirt, and the way she hummed while folding laundry. Those were the pieces worth keeping polished. On a windy autumn afternoon, the sky gray as the day of the reading, I stood in the yard and let her last message settle like a truth I no longer resisted. Live free of their judgment. It no longer felt like a plea. It felt like a life. 6 months after the will reading, the sharp edges of those days had dulled into something I could carry without flinching. The house no longer felt like a battlefield, though echoes of that tense conference room sometimes rose when the wind rattled the old windows. My father's threats had dissolved into silence. He never followed through with court filings. Perhaps even he knew that dragging my mother's name through mud would only bury him deeper. Ryder's attempts at needling me dwindled to one bitter message, then nothing. I realized eventually that silence was not only their defeat, it was my peace. Life didn't change in the ways people expected. I still worked at Rosie's, sliding plates of pancakes across chipped counters, refilling mugs, and laughing with the truckers who called me kid, even though I was nearly 30. But now, work felt like a choice, not a sentence. The inheritance allowed me to breathe without every bill pressing against my chest. When I walked home in the evening, the sky cracked open with Montana colors, pink bleeding into gold, then cooling into blue, and I no longer worried about how many shifts I needed to cover rent. Freedom is quiet, and I learned to love that quiet. The house became a canvas for memory and change. I painted the kitchen walls cream, the way my mother had once dreamed out loud. I polished the wooden banister, kept the porch swing oiled so it wouldn't squeak in the wind, and filled the living room with framed photographs. Some were old me in my diner apron, her smiling beside me, coffee mug in hand as if she were in on a joke no one else heard. Some were new sunlight spilling through curtains, flowers I'd cut from the yard, Uncle Grant sitting at the table with his coffee. It was less about decoration and more about weaving her presence into the walls, making the house a home she would have recognized. Grant visited often, sometimes bringing pie, sometimes just conversation. We'd sit on the porch, our mugs steaming in the cool air, and talk about her. Not the hospital, not the whispers of money and betrayal, but the small things. How she brushed dirt from her jeans after gardening, the way she folded laundry while humming, the lavender soap she loved. Those details became more precious than the accounts or the deed. In remembering them, I was keeping her alive in ways a will never could. And yet, the absence lingered. Some nights I sat alone at the kitchen table, the USB drive resting in my palm like a stone pulled from a river. I never pressed play. I didn't need to. Her words lived in me, her pride, her warning, her love. Carrying them in memory felt truer than replaying them through a machine. Still, the drive remained on the table, a reminder of promises kept and battles won, not with shouting, but with quiet resolve. Seasons shifted. Snow blanketed the porch in winter, then melted into muddy spring. Summer brought heat that rattled the screen doors, and autumn painted the yard in orange and red. With each change, I settled more into the truth she had given me. My life was mine now, not measured by my father's dismissive sneers or Ryder's smug comparisons. Their voices no longer echoed in my head. Instead, I heard hers, "Live your life free of their judgment." At first, those words felt like armor I needed to survive. Later, they became a gentle truth, not protection, but freedom itself. One afternoon in late autumn, the wind tugged at the branches and the sky hung heavy with gray. I stood in the backyard, leaves scattering like whispers across the ground. It struck me then how different the silence felt compared to that day in the oak-paneled room. There, silence had been sharp, suffocating, filled with unsaid accusations. Here, it was expansive, a kind of peace that let me breathe. I walked back inside, the smell of fresh coffee curling through the hallway. Sunlight caught on the photo of my mother in the living room. Her laugh forever paused in that frame. For a moment, it felt as though she was there, watching, approving, proud. I smiled not because I had won, not because I was rich, but because I was exactly where she wanted me to be. And that was the real inheritance, not the house, not the money, but the freedom to live without bending under judgment, to carry her love forward without fear. It took the storm of betrayal to show me that peace is not given. It is built, moment by moment, choice by choice. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living in a way that finally felt like mine. Time has a way of sanding down even the sharpest moments, and yet some memories refuse to fade. The will reading remained etched in my mind, not as a wound, but as a turning point. A moment when my mother's voice carried me across a line I could never step back from. 6 months had become a year, and with every season, the house grew less like a relic of grief and more like a home pulsing with life. My father and Ryder had receded into the distance, their anger crumbling into silence. Occasionally, I'd hear whispers from townsfolk about Ryder's latest failed venture or my father's strained business. But those stories no longer hooked themselves into me. They were simply noise, background static to a life I no longer lived in their shadow. I kept working at Rosie's Diner, not because I had to, but because it anchored me. The clang of dishes, the hiss of the coffee pot, the familiar rhythm of greetings and orders, it all reminded me that dignity is not measured in paychecks, but in the way people look you in the eye when they say your name. Customers still called me Paisley with warmth, and my boss still trusted me with the keys to close. Wealth hadn't changed those things, and I was glad. If anything, it gave me the freedom to work fewer shifts, to choose time with friends, or quiet evenings in the garden over scraping every penny for survival. Uncle Grant's presence became a steady thread through those months. He'd stop by with stories about my mother from when they were children, tales of summers spent barefoot in the fields, or winters huddled around a wood stove, telling jokes to keep the cold at bay. I realized then how little I had known about her life before she became my mother. In learning those pieces, I found myself closer to her than ever. We laughed sometimes until tears rolled down our cheeks, and other times we sat in silence, sipping coffee and letting the quiet speak. It was through him that I began to understand the depth of her choice, why she trusted me with everything. It wasn't just about money. It was about faith, about believing I would carry her legacy with honesty and strength. The house itself bore the marks of change. The cream-colored kitchen walls glowed warmly in the morning light. The porch swing, freshly oiled, became my favorite spot to watch thunderstorms roll across the plains. I planted lavender in the garden, the scent drifting on summer breezes like her gentle reminder that love lingers even when the person is gone. Sometimes neighbors stopped by, curious about the renovations or simply wanting to reminisce about Grace Miller. They told me stories I hadn't heard about pies she donated to church events, about the way she always remembered birthdays. Each story stitched her more firmly into the fabric of my days. The USB remained untouched, though it never left the kitchen table. Its small black shape carried the weight of everything her love, her justice, her final instructions. I never pressed play again, but knowing it was there kept me steady. It wasn't the words I needed anymore. It was the memory of her trust. That trust had reshaped my life more than any dollar amount. It reminded me every morning that I was seen, valued, and believed in. Even when others had dismissed me as nothing more than a waitress, sometimes, though, fear crept in at the edges. What if I wasted this gift? What if I failed to live up to the faith she placed in me on those days? I would sit on the porch and let the wind whip across the plains, reminding me that life is not lived in certainty, but in courage. My courage was in choosing to keep showing up to work, to laugh, to plant lavender, to live not as an heir, but as myself. One autumn evening, as leaves scattered across the yard, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. I was free. Free from the sneer in my father's eyes, free from Ryder's smug comparisons, free from the invisible measuring stick I had once let them hold over me. I didn't need their approval, and I didn't need to prove them wrong. The proof was already in the life I was building, brick by brick, moment by moment. When I walked back inside that night, the house smelled faintly of lavender soap. Sunlight spilled across the photo of my mother laughing in the diner. For a moment, I could almost hear her voice again, live free of their judgment. And I finally understood it wasn't just advice. It was a blessing, a path forward, a promise that I was enough, exactly as I was. Years slipped into rhythm, the kind that folds into itself until you realize that survival has quietly transformed into living. I didn't measure life by the inheritance anymore, though the house, the accounts, and the insurance had given me a foundation I never dreamed of. Instead, I measured it in mornings on the porch swing, in laughter with Uncle Grant over coffee, in the way lavender bloomed each spring as if my mother's touch lingered in the soil. What once felt like a battlefield had softened into home, every corner carrying both her absence and her presence at once. My father and Ryder became ghosts of a story I no longer needed to tell. They stayed away, their silence louder than any argument. Occasionally, I caught sight of Ryder online, still chasing image over substance. His smile strained at charity galas, where captions tried to convince strangers he was devoted. My father, I heard through whispers at the diner, was struggling to hold on to business deals that slipped through his fingers faster than he could sign them. But none of that touched me anymore. Their judgment, once sharp as knives, no longer cut. They had lost the only thing that mattered, my mother's faith, and without that, everything else was noise. At Rosie's, I found myself working fewer shifts, not out of laziness, but because I finally could. I volunteered at the local library, started a small writing group where stories of ordinary people took center stage, and even enrolled in a night class on creative writing. For the first time, I allowed myself to dream beyond survival. I wasn't chasing titles or paychecks. I was chasing the kind of fulfillment my mother had always seen in me. Each step forward felt like a conversation with her, a way of saying, "I heard you. I'm living." The USB still sat in its small wooden box on the kitchen shelf. Some nights, I'd hold it in my palm, feeling its weight as though it were more than plastic. I never pressed play again, but I didn't need to. Her words had carved themselves into me, steady and unyielding. They guided me when doubt tried to creep in, when loneliness pressed against the edges of quiet evenings. It reminded me that even in her absence, I was never without her. Her voice wasn't trapped in the device. It lived in me. Seasons passed, and with them, healing became less about pushing pain aside and more about weaving it into something whole. Grant and I planted a small garden in the backyard one spring. Rows of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. Lavender framed the edges, a border of memory and hope. Neighbors often stopped to admire it, some offering seeds, others just sharing conversation. I learned that community, like family, is chosen in moments of kindness and shared labor. I had lost a mother, but gained a network of quiet support that held me up in ways I never expected. On the anniversary of her passing, I sat alone on the porch at dusk. The sky stretched wide, painted in streaks of orange and violet. I held the photo of her laughing in the diner, her eyes crinkled, her hand wrapped around a mug of coffee. For the first time, the ache in my chest softened into gratitude. She had given me more than an inheritance. She had given me freedom, dignity, and the knowledge that love, real love, is not measured by money or approval, but by presence. She had trusted me with her story, and in honoring it, I had found my own. As the wind carried the scent of lavender across the yard, I whispered into the fading light, "I'm living, Mom, just like you asked." And in that moment, I realized the lesson her life had carved into mine. Our worth is not defined by those who diminish us, but by the love we give and the resilience we carry. No sneer, no insult, no betrayal can erase that truth. So, if you've ever been told you're less, that your life doesn't measure up, remember this. Sometimes, the quietest strength is the one that outlasts every storm. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below about what living free of judgment means to you.